Okay, good evening, everyone. We do have regrets from Christine Thatcher and Michael Barrett. So I'd like to call this meeting to order, and I'll do the land acknowledgement. The Durham District School Board acknowledges that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships, both historic and modern, with the territories upon which our school board and schools are located. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous peoples from across North America. We acknowledge that the Durham region forms a part of the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, the Mississauga peoples, and the treaty territory of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. It is on these ancestral and territory lands that we teach, learn, and live. Are there any declarations of interest? Seeing none, I'd like a motion to approve the agenda, please. Donna, thank you. And so we're right into the additional draft policy and procedures. So we'll just go right into that. If anybody has any comments, questions.
I can begin, Chair Stone, if you like, just to set some context. Would that be okay?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So at the last governance meeting, we agreed we would bring some further procedures to the trustees in terms of procedures that supported the policy of the human rights, anti-discrimination, anti-racism policy. And so we acknowledged that there was still the complaints process and the accommodations procedure that needed to be part of that complete package. However, in tonight's package and in the report that captured it, we also identified that we needed a complementary policy that went along with the draft policy that you saw last time at governance. And this policy is one that's related more to the worker experience in Durham District School Board. So the policy that you have in this package was based on when we were doing the phase 1 of consultations around the human rights policy, staff identifying the need in terms of their own processes and culture. We did have one policy that was more limited in scope previous to now. So the current draft policy in front of you is a more expansive one in terms of the worker experience. And the intention behind it is to streamline the worker experience in terms of when they have a concern about the culture. This is certainly something we heard in the phase 1 of the consultations. It was also something that's come from the Howitt cultural assessment that we've done in terms of wanting the safe and respectful workplace policy, but also understanding we need a process in terms of preventing harassment and preventing sexual harassment and other undesirable behavior. So what we thought this evening we could do is focus the first part on Superintendent Mundy just walking you through that draft policy and the corresponding procedures, and then take any questions there may be, and then turn it over to Human Rights Advisor Mather in terms of the 2 further procedures that were related to the human rights policy that you saw last time. Recognize there's a lot of material here. When we go out to do the consultation with key stakeholders, we'll definitely take your advice in terms of streamlining and having executive summaries. But for the purposes of this group, wanted you to have the full package in terms of all of the content. And if you're comfortable, I'll turn it over to Superintendent Mundy now just to highlight for you very briefly the first of those policies and procedures, and then we'll turn it over to the remaining 2 procedures, if that's all right, Chair Stone.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you, and through you, Chair Stone. So yes, as Director Marsh said, we're pleased to share the draft workplace harassment, workplace sexual harassment, and safe and respectful workplace policy and procedure tonight. We want to note that this draft policy and procedure has not been yet shared with either our federations or our unions, as we're bringing it here tonight for first view, and we will be following up with consultation, and we look forward to bringing this back alongside the human rights policy after consultation. The current workplace harassment and workplace sexual harassment policy and complaints procedure has been updated and revised to include expectations for a safe and respectful workplace. The draft policy and procedure now also covers discrimination, under the proposed draft human rights policy, as well as conduct that doesn't meet the standard of workplace harassment under the Ontario Occupational Health and Safety Act, but does create an unsafe and disrespectful work environment. This policy is designed to promote a healthy, respectful, and supportive workplace and learning environment. The goal is to prevent unacceptable conduct and, where necessary, to investigate and respond to incidents or complaints. The policy and procedure outlines expectations for professional and respectful workplace. It creates an easy, straightforward, and consistent process for all staff to follow. The procedure includes steps to raise and address employee workplace harassment, human rights complaints, and other workplace negative conduct. It makes explicit our board expectations necessary to maintain a safe and respectful workplace. This procedure supports early resolution and restorative options and also explains the investigation process for formal complaints. So when you go through the policy as it's provided to you first on Appendix A, it identifies some definitions which we wanted to clarify in terms of what disrespectful conduct is, which sets sort of those clear expectations for the workplace. It does provide some information in terms of roles and responsibilities, outlining that for workers, and the importance, obviously, of confidentiality. The procedure outlines the process in terms of complaints. So allows an opportunity for who this procedure applies to, which is our workers or any other individuals who are within sort of that work environment in terms of the roles they play. It reemphasizes the appropriate conduct, and then goes through the process in terms of an informal complaint resolution, mediation as a possibility, and then the formal complaint process. We're happy to take any questions or feedback on the policy or procedure, and I'll lean on Council Cotter as well as we have worked together in terms of preparing this for you this evening.
Thank you, Superintendent Mundy. Devika, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that, or should we start with questions?
I think you can go ahead.
I'm looking for you. Oh, there you are. Sorry. We can go ahead. Okay, so trustees, any questions around the policy? Start with Donna.
Thank you. It's more of the process. And one of the things that I'm not clear on, not that this would happen necessarily, but maybe, it's just that it doesn't clearly outline what happens if the complaint is against the director or the council.
So in terms of, I might lean on Patrick for that one. And in terms, I'm unsure what you mean by council. Oh,
legal counsel position.
The general counsel. Yep, I got it.
Yeah.
Do you want to respond?
Through you, Chair Stone. I think the intention, Trustee Edwards, was to draft it broadly enough so that the complainant could bring it forward to the individual they felt was not in a conflict. That would either be the superintendent of human resources or the director or the general counsel. So that it would be, would hopefully be a situation where one of those three individuals would be able to receive a complaint.
Okay. I'm not sure that was, sorry, Donna, I'm not sure that answered your question, because I think it was whether or not the complaint was against.
Yes, and so I don't think it really addresses it, because when you're looking at reporting and so forth, it's around confidentiality and feeling the ability to actually address one or the other when you're looking at when the complaints of the process. I don't think is clear enough as that what happens if it is. It does mention senior senior positions, but I still don't think it's clear enough.
May I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah, go ahead, Director Marsh.
In relation to it, thank you. So, Trustee Edwards, in the policy, it speaks to going if the conflict is with the person's supervisor, that they would then jump over. So I'm wondering, for example, and we could get more specific certainly, but for example, the notion then, if it were someone in terms of the director position, the supervisor of the director would be the board, and that would be the chair of the board. So I think that's the premise behind it, but we can certainly make that clear. Is that what you're getting at in terms of the reporting process?
Yes, I guess that really is where I'm getting at, is that, it's quite clear when you're talking about, basically director down, but it's not necessarily clear when you're dealing with the director or legal counsel, especially when legal counsel is supposed to be involved in the process. So in the procedure. So I'm just a little concerned from that perspective.
Understood. Thank you.
So just for my clarification too, then if there was a complaint against Patrick, the complaint would come to you then, Director Marsh? Okay, and if something was against you, it would come to the chair of the board. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, Carolyn?
Thank you, and through you, Chair Stone. I have a couple of questions. Firstly, near the bottom of page 6, prevent harassment, discrimination, racism, and disrespectful conduct by actively participating in training provided by the district. Could somebody explain to me what that training looks like?
So as we roll this out, there will be an opportunity. It is something that should be reviewed each year in terms of the process, in terms of what the expectations are and what employees should expect in terms of a safe and respectful workplace, and therefore what conduct they could report on. And we want to stress that part of the focus is also on the informal, right? An opportunity to address issues early and to be able to maybe mediate responses, but also have an opportunity for formal investigations, whether brought forward by the individual or whether appropriate to the circumstance.
So am I to assume, Superintendent Mundy, that you and your department provide that training?
It's part of one of the modules in the workplace violence information that's shared. We would update it, obviously, and adjust it if this, when this policy and updated procedure is approved, so that everybody has the information in terms of how to access it.
Thank you. May I have my second question now, Trustee? Thank you. My second question deals with moving to an investigation. How do you determine if it should be investigated internally or externally? And if we have an external investigation, who performs that?
So part of that is we do have internal roles within the department, and we have our, we call them business partners, and we also have our employee labor relations specialists who are trained in terms of proper investigation. We have to look at the situation, how complicated, what potential outcomes, if we believe that the complaint is if the complaint is true. And therefore, we often work in collaboration with general counsel and also the manager of employee and labor relations in determining what's the appropriate method in terms of internal or external. When we determine to go external, then we also, and maybe general counsel can speak to how we determine those individuals that we work with.
Yeah, sure. Happy to jump in through you, Chair Stone. So I think really the factors that go into whether it's internal or external, I think we could probably boil it down to 3 things, which would be complexity, conflict of interest, real or perceived, and third would be the culture. In other words, we want a result that's going to be acceptable to the parties, that the parties are going to be satisfied was a fair determination of the issues. So I think it's those three things. And if we can be satisfied that those objectives can be met with an internal investigation, we would leave it internal. And if we're not satisfied, then it would go external. And as Superintendent Mundy points out, that's usually a discussion between Superintendent Mundy, myself, looping in the Associate Director or the Director as needed, just in terms of what the case requires, in terms of the appropriate investigator. And sort of I have a roster of investigators, as does Superintendent Mundy, and we sort of review that and figure out who'd be best suited. Of course, there's a lot of policies being revised across the province in workplaces, and these investigators are very, very busy. So that also has to be a factor, is who can we retain, who can actually get to the matter and get a result that's reasonably timely. Because in these sorts of situations, of course, justice delayed is often justice denied. So we have to get somebody who can get in there and actually complete the investigation. So that's an important factor as well.
Thank you for that answer.
Thank you, Trustee Morton. Trustee Crawford. Paul, we can't hear you. You're on mute.
You can't hear me because I wasn't talking. No, I'm when you give somebody 100 pages, it can get a little confusing. So what are we dealing with right now? What pages are we dealing with? Are we starting at the top and we're on pages 1 through 6, or?
Well, I don't think we have been going in that direction. I think people have general questions, Trustee Crawford. Director Marsh?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say we're dealing with Appendix A and B. C and D we haven't yet provided introduction to.
Okay,
but we haven't divided it up more than that.
Okay, I just wanted to sort of stay on the same page because as I went through the whole document, I was having questions come up. But just a general question, we must be working with these things now. These are not new events. So we have policies in place right now, don't we?
We do.
Sorry, go ahead, Superintendent Mundy.
Yeah, I was just going to say we currently have the workplace harassment and workplace sexual harassment policy. This is an update where we've added in information that supports the human rights policy in terms of implementation.
Okay, was there some things wrong with the previous policy that maybe you could direct us to that and say, well, this is what we were doing and this is what we want to do and the reasons for that?
Superintendent Mundy, maybe I'll begin to just build on what you were saying. I think one of the things we heard quite prevalently from staff was sometimes they would do a harassment complaint because they didn't feel, they felt that their work environment wasn't appropriate. And it wouldn't, the harassment is, of course, a legal term and it needs to meet the legal definition. And so very often it didn't meet the threshold of harassment, but it's not to say there weren't challenges within that environment. This policy is broader in terms of dealing with behaviors that don't meet the threshold of harassment, but we would still want to work to remediate so that it's a positive, safe, respectful workplace for everybody. So I think it's a bit of an expansion, and that was a theme we have really heard a lot, both in the first and second cultural assessment, as well as when we went out with the preliminary consultation on the human rights policy. So I think generally speaking, staff will be very happy to see this. The other thing Superintendent Mundy and Council Cotter worked on was streamlining a complaints process. So they didn't have to go to different policies or procedures and do different complaints. They submit one complaint and it's considered under all of the procedures so that it may not meet the harassment threshold, but it doesn't mean because it doesn't meet it that we don't address it. And it's a streamlined approach for them.
Okay, well, that sounds like a good idea because some of these things could be nipped very early with just some discussion. One of the things that I did read, and I'm not sure whether I can find it or not. Oh, here it is. It's under Employees Must Act, and it was 3.9. So I don't know whether we're there yet, or
Is it possible to
whether it has to do with harassment.
Is it possible to identify the folio number?
Okay, it was Employees Must Act. Anyway, maybe if I just read it to you, then you can understand what I meant by it. The employee, because it goes along with what you're saying, somebody has to get involved early. The employee must act and report it to the principal. That's the one line that's in there. Then it outlines A to F, what they should do, because it has to do with immediately interrupting and intervening. And then F, report the incident to the principal. And I just think it's a very good idea to have that separate. Too often, people are going directly to a supervisor or a principal where there could be action taken. I guess you're looking for that, are you?
I believe that's in Appendix D.
If I can jump in, my recollection is that that's in the procedures under the human rights policy, dealing with intervening or interceding to deal with an incident of discrimination under the human rights policy. Have I got that correct, Devika?
And that might be true, but it also sounds like it wouldn't be a bad policy for harassment or just about anything, because the earlier the involvement, the better.
No, totally agree, Trustee Crawford, and certainly that's the intent of what we've drafted in the revised documents. You'll see that sort of as a first issue, we ask the person to go to their supervisor and have a discussion about that. Or if they're not comfortable, they can go to HR or to the general counsel and have those discussions. And the first thing we try to do is resolve it informally before, as you say, before things escalate.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking of the employee involvement. Quite often, they're not sure what to do. They think, well, I've got to take this to the principal, but it sounds as though we're encouraging them to get involved real early, right now, and then later report it to the principal. Don't some of our employees feel that having to go to a supervisor higher, that sometimes that's something they don't want to do because they don't feel that something is going to happen the way it should be happening, or it takes too long? You had mentioned that before about reporting and then nothing happening.
Trustee Crawford, are you directing that question to anyone?
Well,
in particular?
I think it's something that I would like to see in all of the documents, and it's so important for early intervention for someone to do something almost immediately, not wait and not think, well, I have to go to the principal before I do something.
Director Marsh?
Okay, maybe you can just take those thoughts under consideration.
Thanks. I think Director Marsh wanted to make a comment.
Sure, although Human Rights Advisor Mather may wish to go first if you want.
Go ahead, Director Marsh, I can follow.
Okay. I was going to say that you raise a really important point, Trustee Crawford, because we often hear actually there's a lot of fear about expressing the situation that a person has experienced. And they're worried that if they go forward to a supervisor, that they lose control of the process, because once a supervisor is aware, then it does put into action a plan in terms of response. And so there can be a lot of fear about how that's going to play out for them in their work site and relationships with colleagues. One of the things we often advise as well, if it is a member of a union or federation, we often suggest to them to work through it as well if they're not comfortable yet. bringing it forward formally to certainly rely on their union or federation representation if they have that. Not all of our employees are unionized, although most are. So we do work in partnership, and then the federation may bring it to our attention. And they bring it to our attention either representing an individual, or if it's a more general scenario, they can bring it to our attention, just generally speaking, not about a specific individual, just so that it's on our radar and we can try to address in different ways. So there are some avenues open, but the formal approach does involve making a report so that we can address it. If a person chooses to try to address it first and that doesn't solve the issue, then certainly they would then include that in the report they bring forward.
Thank you, Director Marsh. Devika, did you want to add to that?
Thank you, and through you, Chair. I just wanted to clarify too that particular reference, Trustee Crawford, was in the procedure around addressing complaints involving students. Incidents involving students, where when an employee becomes aware of it, there's what the procedure is outlining is that they would report it to their principal. So it's not employee versus employee complaints that has that requirement. And I think that the workplace procedure does indicate the opportunity where it's appropriate and where people feel comfortable to be able to resolve it directly with the person without having to raise it. And we'll get to sort of the rationale for why we have that reporting requirement in the student complaint process in a few minutes. But just a sneak peek of that is that one of the things we want to do is to be able to track the number of complaints and the trends over time. And that reporting helps us to do that when it involves student complaints.
Thank you. Trustee Barnes.
Thank you. A couple of my questions have already been asked. I just wanted to follow up on the one around the director, and we mentioned it coming to the chair, but I would advise that at least two people hear that complaint, so one person is making that decision as to whether or not that's a valid complaint. So I think there should be two people that brings that forward in regards to a complaint against the director or the council position. The other one is the training in regards to the policy. And we talked about training, but are we going to have a one-time training, or are we going to do training where employees have to sign off yearly or every 2 years? I just wanted to make sure that we were robust in making sure that all employees are trained and are aware of the policy. And also in the signing off, is it going to be a yearly attestation, every 2 years? I'm just wondering about those particular things.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. The process we have for our mandatory training, which we rolled out this fall, is online modules. And through the module, we can verify completion and hold those records in terms of acknowledging that people have completed them. So I think that is, a way to move forward in terms of ensuring it's part of our onboarding, but also ensuring it's part of our regular yearly information that goes out to all employees, and we can adjust it, to add to it as needed, and for each year to ensure that it's meaningful and up to date.
Do you have a supplemental there, Trustee Barnes, or another one?
No, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure, because that training is more than once. So if you've gone through it once and signed off, I think it's important that there's a refresher requirement, whether it's every 2 years or once a year or whatever the interval is. But I think that's an important piece because we want to get it to the point where it's ingrained in the culture. So I just wanted to make sure and put that in. And for the signing off, the yearly sign off for staff that are signing off that they have read the policy and they do know what the policy is in regards to what is required. So I just wanted to leave that there.
Thank you, Trustee Barnes. Trustee Morton.
Thank you, and through you, Chair Stone. Further to Patrice's comment, if the complaint is against the director and then the chair would become involved, that second person I'm suggesting would be the vice chair, so that the complainant would come to a meeting with the chair and the vice chair. I think we're covering all of our bases in that way. One other question. When there is an investigation or the results of the investigation are brought to Human Resources, are the trustees ever informed? I realize that confidentiality is extremely important and we definitely want to respect everyone's right to confidentiality. But does the Board of Trustees ever learn how serious some of these problems are or the extent of some of these concerns?
I'm happy to jump in on that, Chair Stone, if that's okay. I think our practice, Trustee Morton, has been where we see a risk around litigation or a risk around that the board should be aware of in terms of informing the public of a situation. I think those are the types of cases we've come to the board with that information and would continue, obviously continue to do that. If it's a workplace issue that doesn't involve those issues, then it's not been the practice to bring those to the Board of Trustees, other than in a, they may find their way into an annual summary in terms of what's been happening.
So an annual summary might be a good idea, just so that we are kept abreast. Thank you.
Trustee Brainy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I agree wholeheartedly with Patrice that any complaint against a director should be with two people. My suggestion would be that it is with board legal counsel and the chair, as opposed to another trustee.
Okay, thank you, Trustee Brainy. That's an interesting comment. How would we make that decision of who the two people would be then? I guess would trustees have to? I don't think we vote on that.
My suggestion would be that it's clarified that the chair should contact the board legal counsel or board legal counsel immediately upon any complaint about the director, that the board legal counsel is informed ASAP.
Yeah, as opposed to a vice chair. Okay.
Correct.
Thank you, Trustee Brainy. Trustee Forbes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I agree with that comment. I apologize for being late and coming in the middle. I would just like to hear from, Councillor Cotter, in terms of best practices around, in the education. I mean, we have a one employee, as we well know, and but all directors have two employers, so it's tricky. So I would be really interested to know what kind of a best practice around this would be.
Yeah, happy to jump in, and through you, Chair Stone. I think this board has operated on the basis that the general counsel does have a dotted line reporting relationship with the board. In some of these instances, in particular, the director's performance review policy and that kind of thing. And so one way to deal with this issue would be to formalize that in terms of any complaints. Then the reporting relationship would be between the general counsel and the board in handling that. I think that could easily be formalized, and then that would provide the board with the benefit of a staff resource, in terms of retaining outside investigators or retaining outside counsel. That could all be then facilitated through a staff member, and then be done in a way that would preserve the confidentiality of the matter. As I say, I think we'd formalize the reporting structure in that case. That way, as I say, because I can enter into retainer agreements with investigators and take care of that end of it, which I think is an important piece of operationalizing the investigation.
Trustee Forbes, do you have a follow-up?
Thank you. I think that makes a lot of sense to me in terms of operationalizing, like you said. So I would be in support of that. Thank you.
So just so I got that straight, did you say, Council Cotter, that if a complaint comes in from the director, you and the chair listen to the complaint, and if need be, to get an outside, somebody from outside to work with you about the complaint, if need be?
Yeah, I was suggesting that I think there could be a way to do that in a way that would preserve the confidentiality by confirming the reporting relationship, and that would allow the investigation to be operationalized. So I don't think it matters whether the general counsel receives the complaint or not. But to Trustee Brainey's point, that would be the sort of the management of the complaint. Could be received by the chair, but he or she would then loop in the general counsel in terms of moving forward.
So then I'm going to go back to, who was the original person who, was it Trustee Barnes? Yes. So Trustee Barnes, your reasoning behind having two people? I just want can you reiterate your reasoning behind having two people?
Well, I think it's an important piece to have two people and not just one person deciding whether or not this complaint is valid or to move forward. It's an important piece of discussion. I like what Patrick is saying in regards to being the resource to help to execute an investigation if there needs to be an investigation. I think, though, we haven't finalized if, okay, is it the chair? Does the chair get a request and she has Patrick come with her to listen to the complaint and then move forward? Or are we having the chair and the vice chair hear the complaint and then we're looping in Patrick? So Patrick, I just wanted to clarify. I got the whole operational piece, but I just want to ask the piece where somebody comes forward.
Thank you, Trustee Barnes. Patrick?
Well, I think that is a policy question for the board, I guess, but I think the options are, so far you've talked about the chair and the vice chair, or, another option is that it go to the board. There's no reason why it would have to go to one or two individuals. It could go to the board as a group. And then that way the board is able to, to manage it as a group. So that is another option.
And I will say to that, Patrick, thinking from somebody that's bringing a complaint forward against the director, we want to make it as least intimidating as possible. So I can't see myself coming forward to complain about Nora to the whole board. So I'm just thinking that it might be less intimidating if there is just a process that's put in place, so that I know if I need to complain about Nora, I come to the chair and the vice chair. The chair and the vice chair responsibility is to loop you in and discuss going forward. Because I'm just thinking from a person that's complaining, filing a complaint, I might not be comfortable with a lot of people in the room or even counsel in the room.
Patrice, you're leaving it general as the director to not personalize this.
We're talking about future hypothetical directors.
Sorry, we'll change it to the director. Nothing against Nora, but I'm just thinking from my point of view. If so, I'm filing a complaint, I would have nothing against Nora, but against a director, and less intimidating as possible.
So is it fair to say then, because I'm also sensitive that this policy is for 12,000 employees and all of the different work scenarios that they'll encounter, that will reference, there will be a special line in terms of should the concern be with the director. With the general counsel, we could have that in terms of the supervisor, it would come to me. So I think we've addressed that, but we could have a specific line then in terms of the director, but I don't want to get too detailed about that. Not that I'm looking to avoid it, but there is another policy in terms of the director's performance appraisal, which also gives trustees insights through the 360 and whatnot. And I don't want this policy for 12,000 people to get too caught up But I do think it's important that we do address it within a line. And within that line, we would then direct the complainant. And my suggestion would be to a member of the board and the general counsel with the member of the board, it may be because they don't know the board, it might be easiest to approach a trustee who would then, the responsibility of that trustee would be to bring it to the general counsel. So it would get known, it would get publicized, and that's probably the friendliest way for someone to bring a complaint forward, would be my recommendation on that one.
Thank you, Director Marsh. Trustee Crawford.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up with Councillor Carter's suggestion, and I think it was a good one. People have to be able to come to the board, whether you put it in writing or not. When they get fed up with the process and they think all the superintendents and the director are working against them, they need another avenue. And it should be to the board. If the board decides that they're going to set up, 3 people or 2 people to hear it, that's fine. That's within what we say. But as to the wording, it should be that those people could come to the board. And what we do with it when we get it and how we handle it, it's just the same as our code of conduct. It says you go to the board. And people need to have access to the board in these situations. I mean, with any kind of luck, there'll only be 1 in a few hundred, but still they need access to us.
Right. So, Trustee Crawford, if we are putting a line in the policy, then it could say the complaint would go to the chair of the board, council, or the whole board.
I would say it should just say go to the board. Now,
but what we were just saying, sorry, Trustee Crawford, for interrupting, but what we're just saying is that many people would feel very intimidated to come to the whole board and would feel more comfortable in a.
Well, just to clarify it, I think what the council is telling us is that you give people access to the board. It's worded that way. It doesn't mean that when they have access to the board that it won't be handled by 1 or 2 people or the people that we, the board, designate to handle it.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Through you, Chair Stone, I think we might be able to draft something to address the concerns, and then you'll have the benefit of some language, I think.
Okay, thank you. Trustee Edwards.
I was just going to sort of tug on what Patrice had said. I agree that, it has to be as a very intimidating process, a very easy process. And it shouldn't be necessarily in the policy. The policy just says that it has to be brought to the attention of the board. It's the procedure that we're going to have to, and I think we have to look at that when we're looking at either the director's performance appraisal or even complaints to the board. We'd have to look at that because I agree with Patrice is that people, no offense, but lawyers sometimes can be intimidating just based on past experience. They feel like they're intimidating. They might not want to. So they might feel comfortable, as Nora said, to go to a member of the board. And I think it's appropriate for us as a board to discuss how we're going to do it. So again, the line could be very simple. It goes to the board. How that is dealt with is done in a procedure.
Thank you, Trustee Edwards. So Patrick, I will leave that to you. Okay, thank you. Any further comments for Appendix A and B at this point? Oh, Director Marsh, sorry. No? Any other comments for Appendix A and B? Trustee Barnes.
And I just wanted to add to the other piece about the report that comes to board. I don't think we necessarily need details of investigations, but I think the board should know how many, based on culture, workplace culture and that sort of stuff, how many complaints were filed or something along those workplace complaints or harassment complaints were filed. I think that that should definitely come forward in our a annual report.
Thank you, Trustee Barnes. I agree with that, and I think it should be broken down into what the complaints were, just so that we see if there's it's really heavy in one area. But Trustee Crawford. Trustee Crawford, did you have your hand up? No? Okay, we're going to go on then. The Director Marsh, did you want to go on to the Appendix C? And
thank you. I'll happily turn it over to Human Rights Advisor Mather.
Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening, trustees, and through you, Chair Stone. As Director Marsh mentioned earlier on, and just to take you back briefly to the October 25th meeting, we took you through the draft human rights policy and two related documents then. One was the draft rights, roles, and responsibilities framework and a draft procedure to support human rights, anti-discrimination, and anti-racism. And so those were what we were calling the proactive and preventative steps to support human rights policy. So for today, we're bringing the final two procedures to complete the draft policy package. One is the procedure to support inclusive design and accommodations, and one is a procedure to outline the student, family, human rights issue and complaints process. So these two procedures set out the more technical and operational processes to respond to accommodation requests and to address issues and complaints. Both are consistent with the policy framework that trustees approved last year, and they include feedback from the first phase of the community consultations. They're also informed by legal requirements under the code, as well as other legislation, and they're also consistent with the guidance that the Ontario Human Rights Commission provides through their policies. And they also uphold the duty bearer responsibilities that we outlined in the draft human rights policy last time. And I just want to again reiterate that these procedures also recognize and respect the distinct rights of Indigenous peoples and work alongside the new Indigenous education policy and procedure as well. So the first of these two procedures is at Appendix C. It's the Human Rights, Inclusive Design and Accommodation procedure, and it starts on page 45 of the agenda package. And so this is for students and for employees, and it sets out the accommodation process. It explains how to raise an accommodation request and some accessible ways to do that, roles and responsibilities of those involved in the accommodation process, what information we might need to support the request, some of the key human rights principles related to accommodation, and then it explains the duty to accommodate, what that means, to the point of undue hardship, what that means and what the factors are that we consider in making that determination. And you may remember that in the last batch of materials, there was a strong emphasis on inclusive design, universal design for learning, and accessibility principles to proactively and broadly design with everyone in mind. And so this procedure covers some of the more specific and unique accommodation needs and considerations and barriers, including intersecting ones, for students and employees that are based on disability and ableism, based on gender identity and gender expression, including safety needs and recognizing identity and expression in various aspects of our learning and working environments, and also based on creed or religion, including the many ways in which religious accommodation needs may arise in our schools and in our workplaces. And it also covers specific considerations for employees in the employment context. And we also want to flag that when it comes to some of these specific considerations, we are going to be seeking feedback from communities again and the groups that we consulted with as part of the next phase of the consultation process. And then the last procedure is at Appendix B, and it starts on page 77 of the package. And this is the Student and Family Human Rights Issue, Incident, and Complaints Resolution procedure. And this outlines the ways in which students, families, and community members can raise human rights issues, incidents, and complaints involving employees under the human rights policy. And so we touched on this really briefly earlier, but one of the key parts of this procedure is that when an employee becomes aware of a potential human rights issue involving a student, they must report it to their principal or to their manager. And if an issue is happening in the moment, they must take steps to intervene and to stop it, and then to report it as well. So this reporting requirement is important because it then triggers a series of steps to respond to the issue, even if the student or the parent or their guardian chooses not to file a complaint about what happened. We still want to address whatever that issue was. But that said, the student or their family can still raise an issue or a complaint. And just before we get into sort of what those processes look like, we do want to acknowledge that complaints processes can be hard to understand and they can be hard to navigate in general. And the same could probably be said about accommodation processes too. And as what we were talking about earlier, it can also be a little bit intimidating. There are a lot of legal principles and steps that we need to follow, and this can create barriers and challenges for people in a lot of different ways. And it can also be and feel really adversarial. And so to try to minimize that, the procedure sets out options for raising concerns to give students and families choice. So one option is to raise a matter directly at the local level if they feel safe doing so. So for example, raising it with their teacher or a principal or another staff member at the school. And the procedure outlines what steps that staff person then has to take to address it, including additional reporting requirements. And where a student or a family prefers to file a complaint, or where they've already raised it as an issue, but they feel it hasn't been appropriately addressed, the second option is to bring forward their complaint to the superintendent. The complaint will be then assessed, and depending on the nature of the allegations and if the parties agree, there are then again some options for resolution, like mediation or restorative practice, or the complaint may require a more formal internal or external investigation. And the procedure outlines what each of those steps are, what they involve, and some of the criteria around those as well. But either way, whether it's an issue raised locally or if it's a complaint raised to the superintendent, the district will take all human rights issues and complaints seriously and won't condone or ignore the allegations. And the procedure outlines all of the steps we will take to address them. And the procedure also sets out what will happen if discrimination is found to have happened. So what the corrective, remedial, or disciplinary responses might be, up to and including termination of employment for employees, as well as any learning needs. And then there are also requirements to monitor and follow up after incidents and complaints to see if further action needs to be taken to resolve the matter. And nothing in these procedures, either the accommodation one or the complaints one, stops anyone from raising complaints formally through external processes like the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. And this procedure then also outlines some general considerations in issue and complaints resolution processes. And these two procedures, the one for accommodation, the one for issues and complaints, they have a couple of common elements to them as well. There's a strong focus on accessible ways to bring forward accommodation requests, issues, and complaints. They emphasize confidentiality, supports, and safety, and including protection from reprisal, and that reprisal is a violation of the human rights policy. Keeping parties informed throughout the processes, so keeping them apprised of any delays and the reason for the delay, documenting actions that are taken, ways to address potential competing rights situations, and collecting, analyzing, and reporting on data to help identify potential trends and potential systemic issues, and then also looking at system organizational learning needs and actions that we might need to prevent and address them. And I think one of the important things for both of them is that they also have built right into them consultation requirements at key steps of both procedures so that we're consistent in our approaches, in our responses, and in our decision making, and that we are appropriately applying human rights and anti-discrimination principles and expertise to address a situation. So whether it's an accommodation issue or whether it's an issue or a complaint. And all of that aligns with some of the pieces that you saw in the draft accountability framework to be transparent around the work that we're doing and the impacts of the work. And we're also working on accompanying forms and templates to submit complaints and accommodation requests and to be able to record the actions taken in a consistent way. And as Director Marsh mentioned earlier, we're also developing simplified summaries and process flow charts to hopefully make it a little bit easier to understand the steps and the options that are outlined in these procedures. And those will be part of the final package once the content for the procedures is finalized. I do know that's a lot of materials and information, but that does complete the procedures to support the draft policy. And I should note too that there were a couple of formatting issues and typos in the documents you have in your package. I missed those and I apologize for that, and we'll be sure to correct those before we go out to communities with them. And I'm happy to take any questions and welcome any feedback on the procedures.
Thank you so much, Devika. Gee, I read the newspaper and the headlines in the newspapers have typos, so I don't know what's happening these days. I don't know who reads the things, but okay, so we'll start with Trustee Edwards.
Thank you. And, I appreciate the effort that's been put into this, and definitely both of these procedures and policies. My question is more around the duty to accommodate, and a real concern is around the timeliness of accommodation. In that, and I'm not necessarily saying it's happening to this board, but I've heard it sort of thing where an accommodation is offered, but not till 6 months away. And duty to accommodate is immediate. It's as basically as soon as possible. It's not to say that, I can offer an accommodation 6 months away and please keep your student away until that time, sort of thing. So and it doesn't really, I know we talk about effectively and so forth, but there's nothing in there that it really addresses timeliness enough in the procedure, because and again, it could be that an accommodation is made in the interim on the best solution of an accommodation might happen. So we might offer, this particular service or this additional support until, say, they want a small class placement is offered. That's just an example. So the duty to accommodate is immediate, and it's not necessarily the best accommodation, but to start off, we must accommodate.
Thank you. Thank you, Donna. Did you want to comment on that, Devika, or? Okay.
Just wanted to say thank you for that feedback, Trustee Edwards, and we'll be sure to make that clear in the procedure. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Trustee Crawford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, we might have a duty to accommodate, but we also have a duty to try and do it within a budget and effects on others. I think that's why the Human Rights Code gives us the undue hardship out on some of these things, and they also mention undue hardship and safety has to be considered when we're accommodating different groups or different individuals. There has to be a line drawn somewhere, and I'm hoping the staff does that. I wanted to ask some general questions about when you're putting this together. This is a draft, and what policies and documents is it based on? Is it based on policies and documents that we're already using, or is this new wording? I see smiles, but I don't have any.
Devika, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for the question through you, Chair Stone. It's based on the draft human rights policy that we brought forward on October 25th, and recognizing that we did have some policies and procedures in place that support human rights, that support workplace harassment, that support accommodation, but there were some gaps in those in terms of setting out clear processes, clear expectations, and some of the roles and responsibilities and accountabilities that we talked about last time. And so this procedure is based on that policy, and really that policy is mirroring our obligations under the Human Rights Code as well as other legislation.
Now,
sorry, if I could also jump in, I think it's also fair to say, Devika, that it's it draws a lot on the policy papers of the Ontario Human Rights Commission in terms of best practices.
So we're taking legislation and putting it into words of a policy that we have to follow. And I wonder, does all of staff look at this? Or does it? What's the number of people that look at this? Because I'm trying to figure out our role, our committee's role in this. how much has gone into this and how many people would sit down and argue the wording of this and say, I don't agree with that, this should be changed, et cetera, et cetera. Where are we right now on that?
Sure. Generally speaking, when we're bringing forward revised policy, we do have some staff that do jurisdictional scans just to look at, updates in terms of any regs, legislation to make sure we're compliant. We don't want policies or procedures that aren't compliant with other overarching legislation. Part of the jurisdictional scan will also look at potentially other districts, especially in areas that are not necessarily as well developed in terms of newer policies and procedures. So there tends to be a small work team. They then work on it and then bring it forward to academic council, admin council, and then the senior team reviews it, makes changes. Sometimes the changes or requests are significant, so there's a period of time where the work team then goes back and works on it. And then when admin council feels that it's at a place that it's ready to share with trustees, we then bring it forward to this committee as draft in terms of this is our best advice to you in terms of policy statements, understanding that you'll come at it from a slightly different perspective at times and enrich it from your own perspectives. In the case of the human rights policy, it was a little bit different because it was such a new area and approach that we wanted to make sure that prior to even bringing a draft policy to you, that we really engaged with many different community voices, and in particular those who have historically been most impacted in terms of issues of human rights. So you may recall we brought forward a consultation plan. Human Rights Advisor Mather brought that forward to you. Gosh, it was a year and a half ago, maybe a year ago. And you then endorsed her going out and doing a broad consultation without a draft policy. And then we heard from different communities what was most important to them in terms of a human rights policy, and then worked on that. Should also say that Human Rights Advisor Mather is part of a provincial network. Not every board has a human rights advisor, but more and more boards are certainly employing them. And so she belongs to a network of all of them across the province that are currently in place, and they're all working on policies. And so there's been some sharing at that table as well.
Thank you.
Well, it sounds like it's going to get a lot of people observing it and commenting on it. And of course, it's got a couple of steps to go through. We go from here to standing, and then standing to a motion to board, and then to board sometime in the future. I was just thinking, when I get a 100-page document, I don't know what I can do to help. It's almost as though if I was in the Senate, we might set up a committee to go through it line by line and say, on this line here, this wording here, it's ambiguous, etc. Maybe at the next meeting or a future meeting, we could sort of break this up and say to the trustees or the members of the committee, you take those few pages and line by line it. I don't know how else you can't help but find things that could be a problem later on. And I did want to comment on the examples that were mentioned, and it was said about annual. I would like to see something a lot earlier than that, maybe as part of these meetings or one of the other meetings, a summary of what has taken place, because we really don't even know how large the problem is, how many incidents there's been. We're not involved with these things anymore because we're not involved with expulsions because there aren't any, or even suspensions. So it would be helpful if we were given a report early on, and then we could say, well, good, that's a fine report, bring that to us quarterly or annually. But somehow we have to have more information than we've been getting. One thing I wanted to comment on the document here, because it keeps jumping out at me is district. Lots of times in the past when we've talked about the board, we've talked about the board. Now I think we're not trying to, but we are making a distinction between the district school board and the board of trustees. Are you sort of putting the responsibility on the district to look after this?
So, if I may,
and then I'll shut up.
Thanks, Trustee Crawford. Go ahead, Director Marsh.
If I may, Chair Stone. So, Trustee Crawford, one of the things you may recall when we brought forward the first report suggesting we would phase out regulations and move to a policy and procedure practice, which was in line with governance expectations, one of the things we committed to was that we would bring the procedures that went with the policy. So when you think about the package that you've received, it is lengthy. The policies themselves, though, aren't necessarily where a lot of the length is, but the procedures give you a fulsome picture, understanding that the procedures are operational or within the staff purview. So when we're presenting the policies to you, it's trying to then complement them so that you understand the whole, because otherwise it may be confusing if you don't know, well, how is this going to be operationalized? So we're trying to provide as fulsome a picture. We also, where there were pre-existing procedures or policies, we provide the tracked changes, and then we provide a clean copy, because I get frustrated reading track changes, but I also recognize that people will want to look at the track changes, and I think that's a commitment we've made. So there's a lot of repetition in terms of the package. And then in terms of the actual approval process, of course, it is the policy piece. You're right. Within the procedures, we do identify the district, and we're trying to do that clearly because, as we know in the Education Act, it can become confusing when you talk about the board, meaning the Board of Trustees, or meaning the board in terms of the district and the director's work operationalizing it. So as much as possible, when we're talking about the operationalization, I can't say it right now. I've been in meetings since too early this morning straight through, but I think you know what I'm trying to say. The implementation of the procedure. We do identify the district just to help and clarify to distinguish between the two, understanding, of course, that there's the corporate entity, the Durham District School Board. So I hope that does help in terms of clarifying.
It does help, and thank you.
Thank you. We will move to Trustee Morton.
My question is very, very small. It's a stumbling block for me, and it's a vocabulary question. I'm looking at page 60, 3.76, and the statement reads, misgendering, that is intentionally or persistently refusing to acknowledge a student's or employee's chosen name, pronoun, or gender identity causes harm, is unacceptable and discriminatory, and will not be condoned. I'm stumbling on the word condoned. It's not strong enough. It's too soft. This is a discriminatory act, and it will not be accepted. So I just think the word condoning doesn't fit with me. But maybe I'm just too particular.
Thank you, Trustee Morton. I think they've heard that, right? So we will move to Trustee Edwards.
Just the last comment, somewhat was mentioned that it really doesn't have to do with the procedure. But again, when we're looking at accountability and the board, as far as general reporting, as mentioned, around, as I said, not the details, but you know, the number of complaints, the types of complaints, general categories of, and so forth, so that we have an understanding of what's happening in the board and if our policies are working, or where we need to do work on. So I think that it's important to show that accountability back to the Board of Trustees. And I really like the idea that you have the changing in the procedures to district, because that makes it, to me, it makes it much clearer.
Thank you, Trustee Edwards. Are there any other comments? Okay, I have a few myself, so I will go now. Starting on page 59. I was a little bit disturbed to see that you would keep things private with the student and not let parents know of what's going on in the student, and that even goes into whether or not the student is going to undergo surgery or other procedures. I'm assuming this privacy starts at the age of 16. Because at the age that it's
happy to try to address the question. So one thing I just wanted to clarify is that piece around confidentiality is around respecting the student's rights, and it doesn't have to do with the surgeries when it comes to keeping that information from parents or families. I think that the piece is that we recognize that not all families may be supportive of their child's gender identity. They may not be aware. The child may not be comfortable coming out to them yet. But within our school environments, we have a responsibility under the code to uphold their rights and to recognize and affirm their gender identity. We, of course, value our partnership with parents as partners in learning, and ideally we would be working together with them to support a safe environment for students at school. And I think in many cases that does happen. Where it can't, or because of safety concerns or because the child has indicated to us that there are safety concerns, we have an obligation to uphold the rights of the child, and that's what we're conveying through these sections.
So how do you know if there's safety concerns? How do you know that the child you just take the child's word for it?
I think we would assess each case on an individual case-by-case basis, which is one of the human rights principles as well, looking at things like their age and their ability to be able to understand what the impacts are of the decisions that they're making. But yes, we would take let the child lead in terms of determining how they want to identify their gender when they're in school and learning environments.
I'll just add to that, just from experience being in a secondary school and working with a number of students through, it really is a process for them. And so very often they may turn to someone who they feel that they have confidence in explaining their situation. And then it's a working through in terms of building up the confidence then in the child and that sense of efficacy to then move forward. And so it very much is very often a process that starts off quietly and in confidence and then moves to, when the child's ready to be more public about it. So I would say that very often in terms of the experience that is something that they move through. The most important thing, of course, because we know that these students are at risk, in particular at risk with mental health and self-harm, is that they do feel safe and secure and that there is someone that they can speak to so that we can make sure that they are feeling respected, supported, and safe and a plan to move forward.
Thank you. So a child who is stating that they are trans, do we first, before we encourage them to go ahead, are we first then encouraging them to seek counseling to find out whether or not something else may be interfering with what the child is actually going through? It may not be trans, it could be something else, but maybe that's what they think is happening. So is there any counseling before we're encouraging this child to transition?
So we don't encourage, our role is not to encourage. Our role is to make sure that the student feels supported and safe and that that we're respectful of their rights. We do not encourage any sort of counseling around identity issues. We understand how identity works, and that is not something that we would do. If a student is struggling in terms of how to navigate, that's a different matter, and we would provide supports in terms of the navigation of it, not questioning ever who they say they are and what they experience. Okay, that just surprised me a little bit because
I think also when you're 16 or even younger, these kids are coming out earlier, and guidance is what they're looking for from adults, not just encouraging them to go ahead. I think guidance is something that they need. But however, I have another question. So any child under 16, you would have to be notifying the parents. Is that right?
Under the code, there isn't a set age for when these rights come into play. And so if a child who's 15 or 14 notifies us, we would follow what I outlined a little bit earlier in terms of valuing and affirming their identity and respecting their gender identity in schools and in our learning environments.
So the parents would not necessarily be notified if the child asked you not to notify them?
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm on page 63. Sorry, I'm going to come to the other trustees. I will let you speak. I thought I was going to be the last one, so I saved mine to the end. But so on page 63, when you use the word cisnormativity, are you talking about things like saying, sorry, just a sec, let me get my notes here. Do you mean things like saying men cannot get pregnant or give birth, or that men can't breastfeed, or even use the term breastfeed, or should we use chest feed? Is this what you're talking about when you use the term cisnormativity?
Happy to answer the question. In the glossary of terms that was provided in the previous package, we did define all of the terms that we were using, and cisnormativity was one of them. And what that definition is that it's the common assumption that all people are cisgender and that everyone accepts that as the norm. And that term is used to describe systemic prejudice against trans people.
So when I use that term is okay, that men cannot get pregnant. That's not what you're talking about. Because I looked it up, but I thought that was the type of thing that you were talking about.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I'm following.
I'm just saying there's certain terms when you say cisnormativity. I understood when I looked it up, not in your previous package, but when I was looking it up, that it meant, yes, that the normal, what people would think of normal is that, yes, biological men cannot get pregnant and have babies. I mean, that follows along the lines of what you're talking about for cisnormativity. So people who have those ideas, which most people would, because biological men cannot get pregnant or have babies, that's what I'm just saying. Those kind of comments, is that what you're talking about when you're saying cisnormativity is the normal thoughts that, I shouldn't say the term normal, but the thoughts that, yes, most people are heterosexual. Most women give birth, most men do not give birth, that type of thing. I'm just saying if people are using those terms, is that what you're, I don't know okay. So are you saying cisnormativity is the fact that you cannot believe, or you shouldn't have the thoughts that most people are not from the LGBTQ community, that most people are cisgender?
No, I think it was the definition that was provided is what we mean. We can repeat the definition if you like.
Okay, I'll look it up in the older package. Thank you. Page 65. I'm sure you didn't do this on purpose, but 3.104, you have mentioned all the main religions, but you left out the most popular religion, which is the most populated religion, which makes up most of the BIPOC community, which is Christianity. You probably just missed it, so I'm just wondering if you can add that in there. And I'm going back to page 7. I should have asked this earlier, but I'm wondering why the definition of discrimination changed from the first package that we got, and this description is different. This definition is different from this discrimination. So this, in Appendix A, page 7, the definition of discrimination, you left out that intent does not matter. In the other package, it said intent does not matter. This package does not say intent. And I think if intent does not matter, I think it's worthwhile for everybody to know that intent does not matter, because that's extremely important in this policy. If someone's accused of doing something and they had no intent of offending or being harassment or whatever, if it doesn't matter if you intended that or not. Either it's in there, or it's not. So I'm just wondering, does intent matter or does it not matter? So I don't know who wants to answer that. Does intent matter or does it not matter?
So I'm just going back. So it's Folio 7, Appendix A, definition 2.1 you're suggesting is different from the definition that was provided in the earlier policy. So
Yes.
Councillor Cotter, I don't know if you have any insight into that side of it and whether or not it was an oversight in this policy.
Yeah, I think it was just an oversight. Obviously, the definitions should match. So we'll make
The
that.
wording's different. Yeah, it's almost completely different. So
Thank you.
will you be using the old definition then, or this definition?
Well, I would have to defer to David on that one, but certainly we would make sure the definitions match. But I don't have them both in front of me at the moment. So, but certainly we would get back to the committee on that and make sure the definitions are consistent.
Thank you. I'll move to Trustee Forbes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, November 20th is the International Day of the Child, where, UN has, set forth the rights of children, and we are a signee in Canada of that. So that's, I think, important to just note. And I was just wondering, in terms of, I'm really heartened to see the procedure for making a complaint detailed. And I'm just wondering, as part of this process, and the other things about what we're trying, I think, to achieve, and correct me if I'm wrong, but by laying out this process, we are trying, and these policies, we are supporting all human rights of all people who are, in our school system, employees and students, recognizing that there have been dominant, prevailing kind of dominant attitudes about race, sexuality, gender, and, ability that have caused harm and limited human potential. So I think it's incredibly important that we're really clear about the intent and people's ability to kind of access this document. I was wondering, as part of, this, are we also going to take this to the students in terms of educating them on their rights so that they can, they can be proactive? I think we sometimes as adults don't see or minimize the kind of miraculous ability children have to comprehend things and advocate for themselves. And that's not to say all kids are at the same place at the same time, but I'd be really interested to know what we're doing to make sure that people in, the very important people, the most important people in our schools, not the most, but, the whole reason for being here is our students.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Trustee Forbes. Devika?
Thank you for that, Trustee Forbes, and through you, Chair Stone. Yes, we are, first of all, planning to engage students on and seek their feedback and input on the policy and procedures as a whole. We did go to them as part of the first phase of the consultation, and we'll go back to them as part of the second phase. The other thing that we're developing as part of the additional documents that go along with the policy and procedures, apart from the simplified summaries that we talked about earlier, is sort of like a one-pager that we can post and include in student handbooks and things like that, that outline in a very simple way, as a student of GDSB, here are my rights. I have a right to this, I have a right to this, I have a right to, and to spell it out in a really clear and simple way, to raise awareness about what rights are, and then also where to go if people feel like their rights, students feel like their rights have not been upheld.
Thank you. Trustee Crawford. Sorry, Trustee Crawford, just a minute. Trustee Forbes, did you have a follow-up with that?
No, I was just going to say thank you, but you thanked
Okay.
us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Trustee Crawford.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to go to page 58 of Appendix C, because I think I asked at one time about undue hardship and what is it, but I see that we have put a definition in there. Is this definition right from the Human Rights Code, or is this ours, where it says costs, outside sources, health and safety requirements?
Sorry, Trustee Crawford, what page are you on again?
58
58.
of Appendix C, 335. Actually, it's 334. Undue hardship.
Trustee Stone, if I can jump in, I think it's actually on page 52, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I couldn't see it on 58.
And yes, it's under the heading of undue hardship, and it starts at section 3.34. And yes, these pieces in this section come from the code and from the Commission's policies outlining some of the interpretation of the code and how to apply them in organizational contexts.
So where costs are concerned, for instance, is that someplace, or that's something that we would put the costs into our budgets and operate within it? Can it be that closely monitored?
I think it's dealing more with how you adjudicate an individual accommodation request and assessing the cost to implement the accommodation. Sorry, David, I didn't mean to jump in on the response. Please go ahead.
No, I think you covered that very well, Council Cotter. The only thing I would just add is that as part of the procedure that you saw last time, we did include that as part of our budgeting recommendations, that we include some costs to cover expected costs around accommodation as well.
Well, we'd still have to know where to draw the line, especially if it's as described by Council Cotter, that we're talking about an individual and we're assessing an individual. Wouldn't we have to know how that's going to relate to the whole budget?
Trustee Crawford, I think you cut out.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
No, I was saying that Council Cotter said that it had to do with an individual when you're assessing the costs of an individual, and when you start getting to the undue hardship, well, you have to relate that to the overall budget. I mean, you wouldn't use up all of your budget on one particular individual.
Hi.
Yeah, that's sorry, go ahead,
Dr. Marsh?
Sorry, I wondered if Superintendent Macaulay wanted to walk through this one a wee bit, only because certainly she is someone who works through this process quite regularly.
Thank you, and through you, Chair, if that's all right.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So it really is about individually meeting the needs of each of our students. So the consideration for their strengths, consideration for their needs, inclusive of learning and well-being. And what we basically do is the foundation is in the AODA in terms of accommodation as a collaborative process. So really it's a coming together of parent, caregiver, student, board staff in order to understand the student's need, to look at a variety of options and ways to meet those accommodation needs. And really the basis is that discussion and that collaboration along the way. And in most cases, through creativity and processes that are in place, we can usually make those tweaks. So either accommodation within regular class, or quite often for students with special education needs, for those few, the programs that are supported in the board. We look at the where programming happens, the strategy of how, and who with, what staff are supporting. And then I think part of the conversation as well is always accommodations that meet need. And sometimes we get into conversations around what is a preferred accommodation versus an accommodation meeting need. And usually those two pieces align, again, in that invitation to relationship building and understanding. Sometimes that's a little bit of a dissonance where the preferred accommodation is a bit different than what can be offered or would be offered within an educational setting. And we continue to work through that. As an educational institution, it is really challenging, and I would turn to Pat as well, for a district to meet the threshold of undue hardship based on being for the purpose of educational access. We can usually, in consultation with families, work that through. We do have a very finite number of situations that we then look for a framework of whether that would be undue hardship to the system. Or not. In the vast majority of cases, that is a really high standard for an organization such as a district school board to be able to meet. But really what we do, as I said, is look at it from a relational perspective of an opportunity to support a student or support a family. And it really builds on what strengths the student has and leveraging those, and then what are the needs of the student and what are the possibilities, and engaging in the conversation where that's a partnership between.
So would these situations be rare?
They are correct, Trustee Crawford, where we would consider undue hardship, very finite number of cases where that would be a consideration. And then most of those we have not met. We would not be at the point of meeting that threshold.
And rarely would it be an issue that cost is the factor
Correct.
that would tip us over the edge on undue hardship. It's usually something else around the operations that makes it impossible to do it, rather than the cost factor.
Yeah. So Trustee Crawford, an example would be a request outside of our mandate. So our mandate is educational experience for students, inclusive of their learning and well-being. Quite often in the portfolio that I have the privilege of being in the conversation of, it's the pressure point around, say, a Ministry of Health provided service that is outside our mandate, but our mandate is funded for educational access. And so just those different pieces, but quite often then we're engaging a community partner and helping leverage the family or the student over to the appropriate supports through an interministerial piece. So very rarely do we get to a point where we would be saying undue hardship. We certainly want to look at how we support all of our kids.
And I guess C is pretty important as well. It's something that's easier to measure, the health and safety requirements, and that would be the health and safety of all people, correct? That could
Correct.
be involved in that.
Yeah. So within the, sorry, through you, Chair, if that's okay to respond.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Within our procedures as well, the consideration of accommodation, and the AODA sets this out as well in legislation, that it's a consideration for the accessibility or accommodation needs of the individual in the context as well of the environment and those around them as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? I have one last question myself, which is goes back to informing parents of your children's decisions at school. If you don't inform the parents that a child is trans because a child doesn't want the parents informed, I'm just wondering, in general, do we send any information out to parents saying that if this is the case, we do not inform parents of what will be going on if the child has asked that. So it's nothing specific, but is it a general letter that goes out to parents so that they know that they may not be informed?
Through you, Chair. Oh, you can start if you like, Human Rights Advisor.
Thank you. I was going to say, I don't think that we send out a formal notification like that, but we hope to raise awareness through the release of these policies and procedures and through the consultation process around them.
So the parents will see this, and therefore they will see that in the policy. Thank you. Okay, trustees, it's 8 o'clock. And unless there's any further business or any further questions, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. Okay, thank you. Good night,
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.